Hey everybody, it's Mr. White here with some notes about economic systems. So please get out a pen and paper and follow along as we go through these slides. Now, I think the first and most important thing to address here is what is an economy anyways, okay? Just know that when we say an economy, what we're talking about is a systematic means of allocating scarce resources to meet the needs and wants of society. So in other words, we're saying that resources are scarce. Scarce or scarcity just means finite, limited. All resources are limited. So we have to have a really smart way of using our resources since none of our resources are unlimited. And every civilization throughout history has had to have an economy for that very reason, because of scarcity. Now, all economic systems are slightly different and they change over time, but they're all trying to answer the same basic questions. Now, when we talk about resources, I think it's important for us to categorize what kind of resources are really interesting to us as economists. The way we usually categorize these resources are in four groups: capital, entrepreneurship, land, and labor. And the easy way to remember that is with the acronym CEL. Now, capital doesn't mean like the capital of a nation or an uppercase letter. In economics, capital means man-made tools that produce goods and services. So think like construction equipment like you see here. You can build a home or even a parking lot or something, I don't know, whatever you want. You can build things with one of those tools, right? So that would be considered capital. So any kind of man-made tool is capital. Entrepreneurship means business leadership that combines capital and the other two factors of production, land and labor, to produce goods and services. So in other words, there has to be somebody with a good idea to combine these resources in order to make products and services. Now, land in economics doesn't just mean flat dirt. It means raw materials that come from nature. And you got to have land resources to produce almost any good or service you can imagine. And last of all, labor just means the effort of workers who produce goods and services. So we need workers to produce things. Now, as I said, economies are designed to answer questions about how to use resources. And there are three basic questions when we're talking about resource utilization. The first question is, what should we make with our scarce resources? The second question is, how should we make things with our scarce resources? And the last question is, who gets the things that we make with our scarce resources? So if you're just trying to think of a quick way to remember this, what should we make, how should we make it, and who gets it? Now, a long time ago, before modern civilization, you could think like hunter-gatherer times up through maybe some of the very earliest civilizations. We had what were called traditional economies. They don't really exist much today unless you're out in the middle of the Amazon rainforest living with some indigenous peoples. But in a traditional economy, the way things worked was that production was designed to meet the needs of a small group of people, think like a tribe, maybe 50 people or less. Now, because everything was so small scale, there wasn't really any private property. And because there wasn't really any private property and the economy was so small, there was no need for money. You basically bartered with your neighbors, meaning you could trade things with them. And back then, production and roles in the economy were determined by the rituals or the customs or traditions of that particular culture. So for example, part of their production might be harvesting corn, and perhaps every year there's a special tribal dance that they would do as a part of the corn harvest. So in other words, the way they produced was partly based on tradition, not necessarily on any notion of efficiency or good resource utilization. So as I said, these don't really exist anymore, but we just kind of use this as I guess you could say, an example to compare against the more modern economies that we are going to study in this class. Now, when we're trying to categorize a modern economy, it's a little bit tricky because modern economies don't usually come with a label that says, hey, I'm capitalist, or hey, I'm communist. Sometimes countries might label themselves as that, but that's maybe more of a political statement than it is any kind of an actual statement of the way that their economy works. Now, in some countries that we would call capitalist or free enterprise countries, the private sector gets to answer those three basic economic questions: what to make, how to make it, and who gets it. When I say private sector, I just mean companies that are owned by regular people, right? Companies that are owned by people like me or you, not companies that are controlled or directed by the government. So just know when we say private sector, we mean run by the people, okay? Now, there are some countries where the private sector, meaning the people, and the public sector, meaning the government, can both answer economic questions of what to make and how to make it and who gets it. Now, in reality, all countries in the world are basically some degree of socialist, right? They're a mixed economy. But now some countries like the US are more on this end of the spectrum, like where I'm scratching. It's not like I'm crossing out freedom, but maybe let me address this real quick. Maybe what I'll do instead is I'll put an arrow like at this level of the spectrum, okay? So in other words, in the United States, we have a lot of economic freedom because most of the decisions about what to make, how to make it, and who gets it fall to the private sector, but the government does still answer some of those questions. Now, the opposite of free enterprise is what's called a command economy, and that's where the public sector or the government gets to make most of the decisions or all the decisions about what to make and how to make it and who gets it. So if we were thinking of a communist country, we could think like North Korea. They would maybe be more like here on the spectrum. Now, the reason why they're not all the way over here is because even in North Korea, there are some small degrees of economic freedom, but almost every economic decision is going to be made by the government. So yeah, I don't know, maybe we could even move North Korea. Well, I'll be a little bit more hard on North Korea. There we go. Okay, now countries like, for example, Venezuela might fall somewhere like here. And they would call themselves socialist, but in practice, they behave more like a command economy. Countries like France would maybe be more like somewhere like here, okay? Where France is a socialist country, but they do have quite a bit of economic freedom. So they're a little bit more close to the free enterprise side of things. Maybe a country like India would be someplace like here, China would be someplace like here, maybe Russia would be right around the same area. So all those countries would be considered socialist. Now, here's a cool way to visualize this. Let's take a look at a world map and we'll see sort of where are the free enterprise countries and where are the command economies and where are the mixed economies. So on this world map here, you can see that the countries that are blue, like for example, the USA, okay, or Canada, or Britain, or Australia, or Japan, all of those countries are what we would call free enterprise. They tend to be the most free economically. So if you look on our key down here, you'll see most free. Okay. Now, the countries that are in green and yellow are the ones that have mixed economies. And as I said, they can kind of lean more towards a command economy where the government has a lot of control. That would be the countries that are like yellow. So for example, countries like Brazil, or Russia, or China, those countries are mixed, but the government has quite a lot of control. Countries that are green, like for example, France or Saudi Arabia, those are countries where the government does have a lot of control, but there's also quite a lot of private control, more private control on balance than government control. And then the last ones, the ones in red, like for example, Venezuela, or Argentina, you can see those countries are the ones that are more tightly controlled. Also Iran, yeah, there's Iran right there. In other words, we would call them centrally planned or command economies, where the government has quite a lot of influence over the economy. It's not quite as free. All right, now, all these economic ideas came to us from, I guess you could say, economic philosophers. And these guys were mostly mathematicians or economists or historians, sociologists that were interested in how resources are allocated in society and sort of what are the effects. Now, one of the first guys to study this in sort of a serious scientific way was named Adam Smith. He was a Scottish-born Enlightenment philosopher and political scientist and economist who lived during the Enlightenment period. So he had ideas about like individual freedom and liberty, and those very much influenced his economic ideas. Now, his most important work was an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. A lot of the time, just for shorthand, you'll hear people just refer to this as the wealth of nations. And that was in the year 1776. Now, the wealth of nations is considered the intellectual foundation of free enterprise, also known as capitalism. Okay, so the idea of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, in case you forgot from your U.S. history class, is just the idea that the government should stay out of the economy and let the free market reign. The free market was referred to Adam Smith as the invisible hand. The invisible hand meaning that you don't need the government to set prices and production quotas. People are going to produce what people want to buy, right? If you're going to run a business, it makes sense to produce what people want to buy because you're trying to produce to make money for yourself. And that will actually make society better off. Now, I know the idea of producing things only to make a profit for yourself sounds really greedy, but at the end of the day, it works out. Adam Smith said it a little bit more eloquently than me. Adam Smith said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests." He was Scottish, you know. What he's saying there, it's not from benevolence. Guys, benevolence means generosity. It's not from generosity that the brewer, the butcher, and the baker produce food for us. It's because they're looking out for themselves, right? They're trying to make money for themselves. And that sounds greedy, but at the end of the day, everybody has enough food to eat, and that works out best. So when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, what he was trying to figure out is what makes a country rich. And what Adam Smith decided is that efficiency makes a country rich. And the most efficient economies are the ones where people decide what to make and how to make it and who gets it according to their own self-interests, the invisible hand, instead of any kind of a government initiative or government direction. Okay? Now, that became the dominant ideology economically, starting right at the end of the 19th century, okay, more like the end of the 18th century, pardon me, which is like the 1700s, all the way through the 19th century, which is the 1800s. And so, during that time, the Industrial Revolution kicked off. And of course, you might remember the Industrial Revolution was really amazing. We got new technology that made production completely more efficient and better. But at the same time, we also had a lot of downsides, think like child labor and pollution. Now, one guy who lived through the Industrial Revolution was Karl Marx, and he was born in Germany. He was a sociologist and political scientist and economic philosopher, and he really did not like capitalism. He actually attributed a lot of the bad things in society to capitalism and believed that capitalism should be overthrown and replaced with something different. Now, his two most important works were the Communist Manifesto, which you've probably heard of, but he also wrote another book the same year called Das Kapital, which is just sort of a stinging rebuke of capitalism. It just sort of puts down capitalism in every single way and talks about why capitalism is so bad. Now, this was the intellectual foundation for a new type of economic thinking that became known as communism. Communism, though, just keep in mind, is really just a command economy. It's an economy where everything is distributed not according to money or private property or profit, but according to people's needs. And the only organization that's big enough or powerful enough to take all the resources and distribute them to everybody equally is the government. So the abolition of private property is a big part of communism, and an equal distribution of goods and services to all citizens is a big idea. The way Karl Marx used to describe it is he would say, "From each according to his ability and to each according to his need." He was German, so that's how he talked. And so the main idea of Karl Marx is that the economy is most equitable, and you'll notice that that's different than the word efficient, but the economy is most equitable when the government decides what to make and how to make it and who gets it according to their people's needs. So in other words, the idea of communism is that it's supposed to make everything equal for everybody, which sounds really good. The problem is that in reality, it doesn't actually work that way. We've seen with the Soviet Union that generally the people in charge of all the resources, the ones who make the decisions of what to make and how to make it and who gets it, are working in their own interests, and everybody else ends up suffering. So even though it sounds good to be working towards equity, it doesn't always result in efficiency, and that leads to shortages and lots of problems that actually make people's lives worse, not better. But luckily, you don't need to know too much about communism. Let's keep it rolling. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, which was the 1900s, we had lots of booms and busts in this capitalist economic system. And it was during that time that we have this new guy named John Maynard Keynes who comes on the scene in the world of economics, the very glamorous world of economics. He was from England, and he was mainly a mathematician, but he also really enjoyed studying economics. As a matter of fact, he wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money that more or less created the foundations of a new type of economics called macroeconomics. So if you're sitting in my AP class right now, you can thank this guy. He's sort of like the inventor of this class that you're in. Now, sometimes we refer to a mixed economy or the philosophy of government involvement in the economy as Keynesian economics. I know it looks like this guy's name is Keynes. Just know that it's pronounced Keynes. Okay, so Keynesian economics just literally means mixed economics, an economic system where the government has a role to play. Now, the reason why Keynes thought that it was a good idea for the government to get involved in the economy is because he lived through a time called the Great Depression, which, as you may remember, is one of the worst economic downturns in U.S. history. Now, during that time, there were a lot of people who thought that the economy would fix itself in the long run. And so they advised that the government should just do nothing, laissez-faire, right? Think like Adam Smith. But Keynes had a different approach. Whenever somebody would tell Keynes that the economy would fix itself in the long run, Keynes would say, "Ah, yes, but in the long run, we're all dead." And what he meant by that is that we don't have time to wait for the long run. Nobody really knows. Even the smartest economist doesn't know exactly how long it takes for the economy to correct itself. But in the meantime, people are suffering. So he advised government intervention. In other words, the government can create jobs by spending money and creating new public works, or by subsidizing people's paychecks with welfare, which nowadays are pretty mainstream ideas, but back in the 1930s were considered pretty revolutionary. So basically what Keynes contributed was the idea that when spending and production are misaligned, meaning when we're either overspending or underspending, or overproducing or underproducing as an economy, government intervention can change spending and restore market equilibrium. So the main thing you need to know is anytime you see Keynes, just think government intervention, mixed economic system. Now, this guy, Friedrich Hayek, was also he was a contemporary of Keynes, but he was very much more on the free market tip. In other words, he really liked the ideas of classical liberal economics, in other words, Adam Smith style economics. Now, he was from Austria, but he also spent a lot of time in England, and he won a Nobel Prize for economics in 1974. Now, he was very, very much, as I said, a proponent of free markets. So he was all for the laissez-faire, capitalist type economic system. And his big contribution had to do with the theory of prices. He actually believed that prices convey really important knowledge that helps markets allocate scarce resources to their best uses. In other words, he said that prices tell us when we need to conserve certain things that are rare, because when something is rare, what happens to the price? It usually goes up. So that higher price communicates instantly to everybody that that thing is useful and rare and important, and we should take good care of it. However, when something is overly abundant, meaning when there's too much of it and there's really no harm to using a lot of it, well, the low price tells us that, right? It tells us, go ahead, use this thing to your heart's content. It's cheap, so we don't really value it very much. And so really that is sort of the secret sauce behind free markets and capitalism. And so whenever you hear about Hayek, just think the price is right. Okay, he never said that, but whatever, we're going to roll with it. Basically, guys, when the government gets involved in the free market, all that information that's conveyed in free market prices gets thrown out. And so society ends up worse off, not better off. And that's sort of like a big rebuke to the idea of communism or a centrally planned economy. Now, the last guy you need to know about is named Milton Friedman. Now, he is the only American guy on our list here, so hey, go Milton Friedman. He wrote Capitalism and Freedom in 1962, and he also won a Nobel Prize in 1976. Got a lot of Nobel laureates here, okay? Now, he's the founder of something called monetarism, okay, which is sort of a modified version of Keynesian economics. Now, Keynesian economics says that the government should step in to stabilize things when the economy is sort of off balance. But Milton Friedman and a lot of other people are skeptical of the idea that the government or any central authority knows exactly what to do with the economy. As a matter of fact, Milton Friedman once said, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert in 5 years, there'd be a shortage of sand. Yeah, so you can see he didn't have a really bright and rosy view of the government. Basically, he said that the banks should stabilize the economy by changing the amount of money, right? If there's more money, the economy speeds up, and if there's less money, the economy slows down. That can get everything back on balance again. And he thought that the government should only get involved if there's really an extreme circumstance. So basically, Friedman's idea is that when spending and production are misaligned, changing the money supply is what you need to do to get the economy back to equilibrium and make everything a-okay again. All right, guys, that is it for our notes about economic systems. If you have any questions, please contact me. Other than that, I'll see you later. Have a great day.